The banker's men ripped the foreclosure notice from the courthouse board and nailed it to Clara Whitmore's front door before sunrise. By noon, Clara was standing in the middle of the dusty main street with her infant daughter clutched against her chest, trying to shield the baby from the cold prairie wind. Grace was too hungry to cry properly. The little girl's weak sobs barely rose above the murmurs of the crowd. Around them, townspeople watched from the boardwalks. Some stared with pity. Most looked away. A few whispered openly about the young widow in the faded black dress, whose heavy body had become the town's favorite target for cruel jokes. Victor Harlan stood near the courthouse steps with a polished cane in one hand and a stack of legal papers in the other. He spoke calmly, almost kindly, which somehow made his words worse. "The debt is unpaid," he announced. "The property now belongs to the bank." Clara tightened her grip on Grace. The small house had been the last thing her husband left behind. Now even that was gone. The preacher stepped forward and removed his hat. "Mrs. Whitmore needs shelter," he said. "She needs work. The child needs food. Is there anyone willing to help?" Silence answered him. Men who had once accepted pies from Clara's kitchen suddenly found great interest in the dirt beneath their boots. Women whose dresses she had repaired looked toward the church instead of toward her. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Grace began crying harder. Clara lowered her head. She had survived losing her husband. She had survived hunger, loneliness, and endless gossip. But standing there, while her daughter cried from hunger in front of the entire town, felt worse than all of it. Victor's lips curved slightly. "If no arrangements can be made," he said, "the widow and child will need to leave the property before nightfall." What neither Clara nor most of the crowd understood was that Victor wanted more than a small piece of land. That forgotten parcel sat directly along the route being surveyed for a future railroad line, and Victor had been trying to get it for months. Then a single pair of boots stepped off the boardwalk. The sound seemed louder than the baby crying. Heads turned. A tall rancher moved through the crowd without hurry. Dust covered his coat. His weathered hat shaded a face known across 3 counties. Ethan Walker. He stopped in front of Clara. For a moment he looked only at Grace. The child was trembling. Then he looked at Clara. Not at her size. Not at her worn dress. Not at the gossip surrounding her. He looked directly into her eyes. If you've ever wondered how quickly a life can change, it sometimes happens in the space between 2 breaths. Ethan removed his hat. Then he turned toward the silent crowd. "If no one here wants the widow or her child," he said, his voice carrying across the street, "then step aside." The entire town seemed to freeze. Ethan glanced back at Clara and the baby. "I'll take them both." No one spoke. Not even Clara. And before the shock could fade, a rider appeared at the far end of the street, carrying a sealed packet marked with the railroad company's crest. The silence that followed Ethan Walker's words lasted only a few seconds, but for Clara Whitmore, it felt like an entire lifetime. She stared at him in disbelief. The baby cried against her shoulder. The crowd stared. And Ethan remained exactly where he stood, as though he had merely commented on the weather instead of turning an entire town upside down. Victor Harlan recovered first. "Mr. Walker," he said smoothly, "surely you're not making a decision this serious in the middle of a public spectacle." Ethan never looked at him. "I'm making it because nobody else would." A murmur spread through the crowd. Clara felt dozens of eyes settle on her, some curious, some mocking, some openly amused. Her cheeks burned. "Why?" she finally whispered. Ethan looked down at Grace. "Because that child needs a roof before sundown." The answer somehow hurt more than she expected. Not because it was cruel, because it sounded practical, necessary, like charity. Before she could respond, Grace let out another weak cry and buried her face against Clara's chest. Ethan noticed immediately. When did she last eat? Clara lowered her eyes. Early this morning. The cowboy's jaw tightened. Without another word, he picked up the single-worn suitcase resting beside her feet. Then he nodded toward the wagon tied outside the mercantile. We should leave. The town watched as Clara climbed into the wagon. Nobody offered to help. Nobody apologized. The same people who had accepted her kindness for years simply stood there while she left town with a stranger. As the wagon rolled away, Clara glanced back once. Not a single person stepped forward to stop her, not even the preacher. Only Ethan remained beside her. The journey to Walker Ranch took most of the afternoon. Grace eventually fell asleep from exhaustion. The steady rhythm of the wagon wheels filled the silence. Ethan wasn't much of a talker. Clara wasn't sure she wanted conversation anyway. She kept waiting for him to explain himself, to tell her what he expected in return, to reveal the condition hidden behind his generosity. But the miles passed, and he said nothing. Near sunset, Walker Ranch finally appeared on the horizon. The ranch house stood larger than Clara expected. A broad wooden home surrounded by corrals, barns, and endless pastureland. Yet despite its size, it felt strangely empty. The place looked maintained, functional, but not loved, as if nobody had called it home in a very long time. Ethan helped her down from the wagon. Then he opened the front door. Warm air drifted outside. Come in. Clara hesitated. The words sounded simple, but crossing that threshold felt like stepping into a different life. Inside the house was quiet. An iron stove glowed in the corner. A long dining table occupied the center of the room. The walls were clean but bare. No laughter. No family photographs. No signs of a woman's touch. Just order, discipline, loneliness. Grace began fussing again. Immediately, Ethan moved toward a cabinet and returned with a small tin of condensed milk. I keep supplies for orphan calves. Clara blinked. He looked almost embarrassed. It'll work until we get proper milk tomorrow. Within minutes, Grace was drinking. For the first time all day, the baby's crying stopped. The silence that followed felt almost sacred. Clara looked down and felt tears threaten her eyes. She forced them back. She had cried enough in front of strangers. Ethan quietly turned away and busied himself with removing supplies from the wagon, giving her privacy, giving her dignity. Hours later, after Grace had fallen asleep near the stove, Clara wandered into the kitchen. The shelves were stocked, the pantry organized, but it was obvious nobody actually cooked there. She found dried beans, salt pork, onions, flour, and coffee. Simple ingredients, enough. Without asking permission, she rolled up her sleeves and began working. The smell reached the main room nearly an hour later. Ethan looked up from a ledger. The aroma of simmering stew filled the house. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise. Recognition. As if he suddenly remembered what a home was supposed to smell like. When supper was ready, Clara placed 2 bowls on the table. Ethan stared at them for a moment. You didn't have to do that. I know. For the first time all day, a faint smile touched his face. They ate mostly in silence. Yet it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt cautious, like 2 wounded people standing on opposite sides of a frozen river. Neither ready to cross, neither willing to leave. Later that night, after Clara carried Grace upstairs, she discovered a small wooden chest in one of the guest rooms. The lid had been left slightly open. Inside rested a neatly folded child's blanket. Old, carefully preserved, untouched by dust. Clara closed the lid immediately. She understood enough not to ask questions. Some wounds announced themselves without words. Downstairs, Ethan checked every window before placing a rifle beside the front door. Only then did he extinguish the lamps. The ranch fell silent. But sometime after midnight, a horse approached the property. Ethan heard it first. A rider stopped outside the gate. And by dawn, a sealed envelope bearing Victor Harlan's name had been nailed to the ranch entrance. Ethan removed the envelope from the ranch gate just after sunrise. The seal was intact. Victor Harlan's name was written neatly across the front. Inside was a legal notice. According to Victor, Clara Whitmore was unlawfully occupying property connected to an unresolved debt claim. If she remained under Ethan Walker's protection, both of them could face court action. Ethan read the paper once. Then he folded it in half and dropped it into the stove. Clara watched from the kitchen doorway. "You didn't even finish reading it." "I read enough." She looked worried. "He won't stop." "No," Ethan said. "Men like Victor never stop on their own." The conversation ended there, but the uneasiness remained. Outside, ranch hands began their morning chores. Inside, Clara prepared breakfast. Grace slept in a basket beside the stove. For the first time in months, the baby looked warm. For the first time in years, Ethan found himself slowing down long enough to notice small things. The sound of a child breathing. Fresh bread cooling on a counter. Someone humming softly while working. The house felt different. Alive. That afternoon, several ranch hands gathered for supper. Most had heard the rumors. A few had laughed when Ethan brought home a widow and her child. Now they sat around the table eating Clara's cooking in complete silence. One cowboy finally pushed back his plate. "Mom," he said awkwardly. "Best stew I've had in 10 years. The others nodded. Clara smiled politely. It was a small moment, but it was the first time anyone at the ranch had looked at her without judgment. Unfortunately, word traveled quickly. 2 days later, Abigail Price arrived in a polished carriage. She stepped onto the porch, carrying gifts wrapped in bright paper. A toy for Grace. A basket of sweets. A smile that never reached her eyes. Clara welcomed her inside. Ethan was away inspecting cattle fences. For nearly an hour, Abigail behaved perfectly. She complimented the house, admired the baby, praised Ethan's generosity. Then she finally revealed why she had come. "He has a good heart," Abigail said while rocking gently in a chair. Clara nodded. "Yes, sometimes too good." The room became very quiet. Abigail glanced toward the sleeping baby. "You do understand this arrangement isn't permanent." Clara felt something tighten in her chest. "What do you mean, Ethan enjoys rescuing people?" Her smile remained pleasant. "But rescuing someone isn't the same as loving them." Clara looked away. Abigail continued carefully. "He'll eventually remember who he was before all this. A respected rancher. A man with options." Every word landed exactly where Abigail intended. He deserves a real wife. The silence stretched. Then Abigail stood. As she left, she touched Clara's arm gently, almost kindly. "I'm only trying to spare you future disappointment." After she was gone, the house felt colder. That night, Clara barely spoke during supper. Ethan noticed immediately. He simply didn't know why. The distance between them quietly began to grow. 3 days later, another problem arrived. A weathered rancher named Samuel Pierce rode onto Walker Ranch carrying a wooden lockbox. Samuel had once worked near the mining camps where Clara's husband died. His face looked nervous. His horse looked exhausted. "I need to speak with Mrs. Whitmore." They sat together on the porch. Samuel removed several old documents from the box. "What you're about to see should have been shown years ago," Inside were copies of loan records, debt agreements, land surveys. Clara's hands trembled as she examined them. Something was wrong. The signatures didn't match. Dates had been altered. Amounts had changed. Several pages appeared rewritten. Ethan leaned closer. "You sure about these?" Samuel nodded. "I kept copies because the originals bothered me." A long silence followed. Then Samuel delivered the truth. "Your husband never owed Victor half of what Victor claimed." Clara stared at him. The world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. "What?" "The debt was inflated." Samuel swallowed. "And your husband knew it." Ethan's expression hardened. "That's why he was fighting Victor before he died." Samuel nodded again. "He planned to challenge the debt." Clara felt tears threatening. "My husband said he found something important before he died." Samuel looked directly at her. He did. From the lockbox, he removed a folded survey map. The paper was yellow with age. A red line crossed it directly through Clara's property. Samuel placed it on the table. The railroad. Ethan immediately understood. Victor hadn't spent years chasing a worthless widow. He was chasing land. Land that would become enormously valuable once the railroad arrived. Samuel pointed to the map. "That property sits at one of the most important access points along the future route." Suddenly everything made sense. The debt, the harassment, the foreclosure, the gossip. Victor wanted Clara gone because her name stood between him and a fortune. Before sunset, Ethan rode into town with the documents. He visited the county clerk. The clerk's face went pale after seeing the papers. But when Ethan demanded answers, the man refused. "I can't help you." "Why not?" The clerk glanced nervously toward the bank across the street. Because Victor Harlan practically owned half the town. Fear had controlled people for years, and fear was still winning. As Ethan left the office, he noticed something strange. A rider watching him from across the road. The man immediately turned away. That night, Ethan locked every door. He placed the survey map beneath a loose floorboard inside the ranch house. Then he sat on the porch with a rifle across his knees. Clara stepped outside carrying coffee. "You think he'll come?" Ethan accepted the cup. "He already knows we're looking." She looked toward the darkness. "What happens now?" Ethan stared across the prairie. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he answered quietly, "No child leaves this ranch." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a vow. Inside the house, Grace slept peacefully. Outside, somewhere beyond the darkness, Victor Harlan was already making plans. And before midnight, flames suddenly erupted inside the Walker Ranch horse barn. The smell of smoke hit Ethan before he reached the barn. Flames were already climbing the dry wooden walls. Horses screamed inside. Ranch hands ran across the yard, carrying buckets, blankets, anything they could find. Ethan threw open the barn doors. Heat exploded outward. A terrified horse nearly knocked him to the ground as it bolted into the night. "Get them out!" Ethan shouted. The men rushed forward. Inside the ranch house, Clara woke to the chaos. Grace immediately began crying. For one terrifying second, Clara thought the fire was an accident. Then, she saw something through the window, a man on horseback riding away from the property. Not fleeing the fire, leaving after starting it. Her blood ran cold. Victor had made his move. Outside, Ethan disappeared into the smoke. One horse remained trapped near the rear stalls. The roof above it had already begun collapsing. "Walker!" one of the ranch hands yelled. "It's not worth it." Ethan ignored him. The frightened animal kicked wildly as burning timber crashed nearby. Moments later, Ethan emerged from the smoke, leading the horse by its reins. The crowd cheered. Then part of the roof collapsed behind him. The entire structure shook. The barn was lost, but the horses were alive. By dawn, little remained except blackened beams and ash. Clara wrapped a blanket around Ethan's shoulders. His right arm had been burned. A cut above his eye continued to bleed. Neither seemed to bother him. His attention remained fixed on the ranch house, on Clara, on Grace, making sure they were safe. That was when Samuel Pierce arrived at full speed. His horse was lathered with sweat. His expression carried panic. "They came to my place last night." Ethan stood. "Who?" Samuel didn't answer immediately. He didn't need to. Everyone already knew. "They searched my house." His voice shook. "They were looking for the documents." Clara felt fear settle deep inside her stomach. Victor wasn't simply protecting a lie anymore. He was destroying evidence, destroying witnesses, destroying anyone who stood in his way. "We go to court now," Ethan said. Samuel nodded. "Tomorrow." The county hearing was scheduled for the following morning. If they waited longer, the evidence might disappear forever. If Samuel backed down, Victor might win. If the court accepted the forged debt records, Clara would lose everything. The next day, the courthouse overflowed with spectators. Every bench was filled. Men crowded near the walls. Women whispered behind folded fans. Even people who had ignored Clara weeks earlier now wanted to witness the outcome. Victor Harlan entered confidently. He wore an expensive suit. His hair was immaculate. His smile suggested a man already expecting victory. Abigail Price sat nearby. Her eyes immediately found Clara. The expression she offered was full of certainty, as if she already knew how this would end. Ethan walked beside Clara into the courtroom. Grace rested quietly in her mother's arms. The child had become larger since arriving at Walker Ranch, healthier, stronger. The sight alone gave Clara courage. The judge called the session to order. The case began. Victor's attorney spoke first. The argument sounded simple, legal, clean. The debt existed. The property had been pledged against it. The debt remained unpaid. Therefore, the foreclosure was lawful. Several official records appeared to support the claim. The documents carried signatures, dates, county seals. Everything looked legitimate. The townspeople exchanged nervous glances. Even Clara felt doubt beginning to creep into her mind. Then Ethan's side presented Samuel Pierce. The old rancher walked toward the witness stand. His hands trembled. His eyes briefly found Victor. Victor smiled. Not kindly, not openly threatening. Just enough to remind Samuel of everything he could lose. For several seconds, Samuel said nothing. The courtroom waited. The judge frowned. "Mr. Pierce." Samuel swallowed. His voice failed. Victor's smile widened. Clara felt her heart sinking. This was the moment. The moment everything could fall apart. Then Grace made a small sound from her mother's arms. Samuel turned. He saw the child, saw Clara, saw Ethan standing beside them. Something changed inside him. "I kept copies," he finally said. The courtroom became silent. "Copies of every transaction." Victor's attorney immediately objected. The judge overruled him. Samuel continued. The original debt was much smaller. He pointed directly toward Victor. The numbers were altered later. Gasps spread through the room. Victor remained calm, too calm. His attorney quickly attacked the testimony. Copies could be forged. Memories could fail. Nothing proved the originals had been changed. For a moment it appeared the defense had recovered. Then Ethan stood. He carried a worn ledger recovered from Samuel's lockbox. The ledger contained payment records, receipts, dates, signatures. The judge studied it carefully. Victor's attorney objected again. The judge allowed the evidence. Pressure slowly began shifting. But Victor still wasn't beaten. The forged debt papers remained official county records, and official records carried enormous weight. The judge eventually leaned back in his chair. At this point, he said, "The court still recognizes the filed debt documents as valid." A wave of despair moved through Clara. Victor smiled openly. Abigail folded her hands with satisfaction. Ethan's jaw tightened. They were losing. Then a voice emerged from the back of the courtroom. "Your Honor." Everyone turned. The county clerk stood trembling beside the rear wall. The same clerk Ethan had confronted days earlier. The man's face looked pale, terrified. Victor's expression changed instantly. The warning in his eyes was unmistakable. The clerk nearly sat back down. His courage almost failed. Then he looked toward Clara, toward the baby, toward the burned bandage wrapped around Ethan's arm. And finally, he spoke. "I need to tell the truth." The room fell silent. The clerk walked forward. Each step seemed difficult, painful, necessary. "I saw the papers." His voice shook. The debt records were altered after filing. Victor rose instantly. "Lies." The clerk ignored him. "I was ordered to replace pages." The courtroom erupted. The judge slammed his gavel repeatedly. "Order," the clerk continued. "The county seal proves it." The judge frowned. "What do you mean?" The clerk pointed toward the disputed documents. "That seal wasn't used by the county until 6 months after the debt was supposedly filed." Silence. Pure silence. The realization spread slowly. The seal itself exposed the forgery. The document claimed to be older than the tool used to create it. One small detail. One fatal contradiction. Victor suddenly looked less powerful, less untouchable. The judge requested both documents. He compared them carefully. Again. Then again. Finally, he lowered them onto his desk. His expression hardened. Victor's attorney stopped speaking, because there was nothing left to say. The lie had broken, piece by piece, in front of everyone. The judge's ruling came less than an hour later. The foreclosure was void. The debt records were fraudulent. Ownership of the property returned fully to Clara Whitmore. Further criminal investigation into Victor Harlan's activities was ordered immediately. Deputies stepped forward. Victor tried to protest, tried to argue, tried to threaten. For the first time, nobody seemed afraid. Not the judge, not the clerk, not the townspeople, not even the deputies. As they escorted him away, Victor turned toward Clara. His expression carried pure hatred, but his power was gone. The courtroom doors closed behind him, and for the first time in many years, the town breathed freely. The hearing ended. People began leaving their seats, yet one final confrontation remained. Abigail Price approached Ethan near the courthouse steps. Her voice carried enough volume for everyone nearby to hear. "So this is really what you've chosen?" Ethan looked at her calmly. A widow. Her gaze shifted toward Clara. A woman everyone else rejected. The crowd waited. Ethan looked toward Clara, then toward Grace. The answer came without hesitation. "Yes." Abigail laughed bitterly. "You let her fool you." Ethan's expression never changed. "No." His voice carried across the courthouse yard. "She never fooled me. The crowd fell silent once more. She taught me something I should have learned years ago. He glanced toward Clara. Family isn't who you choose when life is easy. Then he looked back at the town. It's who you protect when everyone else walks away. For the first time, Clara felt tears she didn't try to hide. But even as justice finally arrived, another fear remained. Because winning a courtroom battle was easier than believing she deserved the life waiting for her. The weeks after the trial felt strange to Clara Whitmore. For so long she had lived waiting for the next humiliation, the next threat, the next loss. When none came, she hardly knew what to do with the silence. Victor Harlan's property holdings were investigated. Several fraudulent claims were overturned. The small parcel of land that had nearly destroyed her life remained hers. Yet the greatest change had nothing to do with land. It happened inside Walker Ranch. The house that once felt cold and empty slowly transformed. Fresh bread cooled on the kitchen counter. Laughter occasionally drifted through the hallways. Grace's cradle sat near the stove. And for the first time in years, Ethan stopped eating his meals alone. Still, not every wound healed overnight. Whenever someone knocked unexpectedly at the front door, Clara's shoulders tightened. Whenever hoofbeats approached after dark, she instinctively looked toward Grace. Part of her still expected everything to disappear. One evening, Ethan found her standing beside the window, watching the road. The ranch was quiet. The sun had already disappeared behind the distant hills. "You still think someone's coming?" It wasn't a question. Clara lowered her eyes. "Sometimes." Ethan stood beside her. Neither spoke for several moments. Then he said quietly, "They're not taking anything from you again." The words were simple. But unlike promises made by other men, Ethan's promises always became actions. Months passed. Winter gave way to spring. Spring gave way to summer. Walker Ranch grew stronger. So did the family living inside it. One afternoon, Grace took her first unsteady steps across the kitchen floor. Clara laughed. The ranch hands cheered. Ethan looked more nervous than anyone. The little girl stumbled directly toward him, then wrapped both arms around his leg. The entire room laughed. Even Ethan. Especially Ethan. As the years continued, something else changed. The people of town began changing too. Not all at once, not perfectly, but steadily. The same women who once whispered about Clara's appearance now greeted her by name. The same men who had stayed silent outside the courthouse tipped their hats when she passed. Clara never forgot what happened, but she no longer carried their judgment on her shoulders. She carried something far more valuable: respect. One autumn afternoon, several years after the trial, Grace raced across the ranch yard chasing a puppy. Ethan was repairing a fence nearby. The little girl tripped. Before Clara could react, Grace jumped up, laughing, and ran toward Ethan. "Pup!" the word echoed across the yard. Everything stopped. The hammer slipped from Ethan's hand. Grace threw her arms around him. "Pa, look." She proudly showed him the puppy. For a moment, Ethan couldn't speak. Neither could Clara. Because nobody had told Grace to use that word. The child had chosen it herself. And somehow, that made it mean even more. That evening, after Grace had fallen asleep, Ethan and Clara sat together on the porch. The same porch where she had once arrived, frightened and uncertain. The prairie stretched endlessly before them. Peaceful, safe, home. "You know," Clara said softly, "the whole town thought you were crazy." Ethan smiled. "Some still do." She laughed. Then her expression grew serious. "Why did you really do it?" Ethan looked toward the darkening horizon. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he answered honestly. "The day I stepped out of that crowd." His eyes shifted toward the ranch house. toward the window where Grace slept. I thought I was helping a widow. He reached for Clara's hand. But the truth is, I think I was looking at my family. Clara felt tears fill her eyes. This time, she didn't hide them. She didn't need to. Years later, Walker Ranch became known across the region for something unusual. Widows found work there. Orphans found shelter there. Travelers who had nowhere else to go found a warm meal there. Because Clara never forgot what it felt like to stand in the middle of a dusty street while everyone looked away. One cold evening, many years after Ethan had stepped out of that crowd, another young widow arrived at the ranch gate carrying a child. She looked frightened, exhausted, ashamed, exactly as Clara once had. The woman asked if there might be work, or perhaps a corner of a barn. Any place at all. Clara walked down from the porch. She saw the fear in the woman's eyes, the same fear she had once carried herself. Then she opened the gate, the old gate, the one that now welcomed people instead of turning them away. And with a warm smile, she said the words that changed another life. "Come on in." The woman hesitated. Clara gently touched the child's shoulder. No one gets left out there. If this story reminded you that a family can begin with a single act of courage, write "Step aside" in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. Because sometimes the greatest love story doesn't begin with romance. Sometimes it begins when one person refuses to walk away while everyone else stands silent. This channel creates original storytelling content for entertainment, educational, and inspirational purposes. Some stories are inspired by real events, while others include fictionalized or dramatized elements for creative storytelling. Certain aspects of our videos, including images, narration music, and visual effects, may be created or enhanced using artificial intelligence AI tools. All content is creatively scripted, edited, and curated to provide a unique viewing experience. Names, locations, and specific details may be altered for privacy or narrative purposes. Unless otherwise stated, the stories presented should not be considered fully verified factual accounts. All rights reserved. Unauthorized reproduction or redistribution of this content is prohibited.